Not all movies that get nominated for an Oscar deserve it. In fact, in a lot of cases, the movies that deserve to win don't win. In the worst cases, they don't even get nominated. But in this video, I want to take a look at the worst snubs in Academy Award history. These are movies that did get nominated, but where the right movie lost and, in my opinion, the wrong movie won. That's not even to say that the winners were terrible movies. They just weren't as good as the movie that deserved to win. Most of the losers are now considered some of the greatest films ever made, while many of the winners are long forgotten. As everyone filed into the Biltmore Los Angeles Hotel on February 26, 1942, they were sure of one thing, that the wunderkind Orson Welles would be taking home a lot of gold tonight. After all, Citizen Kane was nominated for 9 awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. To be fair, it had some stiff competition, such as Alfred Hitchcock's Suspense and John Huston's The Maltese Falcon, considered to be one of the best films ever made. Still, everyone was sure that Welles would prevail. His movie had pushed the boundaries of storytelling, cinematography, and editing. It took on one of the newspaper barons of the day, William Randolph Hearst, who would forever be linked to this film. It's the movie that started the cliches that we see today. For example, non-linear storytelling, such as the use of flashbacks, is more common now. That was not the case back then. Imagine everyone's surprise then, when instead of the exciting newcomer, the winner ended up being the traditional, nostalgic, and sentimental How Green Was My Valley, directed by John Ford. Citizen Kane was about Charles Foster Kane, a paper tycoon that no one really knew. Meanwhile, How Green Was My Valley was a traditional film about a Welsh mining family whose lives are transformed as their way of life is eroded. It's a well-directed film in the way that many films that we call Oscar bait today are well-directed. It was a safe movie where Citizen Kane was the propulsive choice. Kane explored themes of power and memory and was willing to critique extremely powerful people. While many praised it in private and among friends, there was something of a hush that fell over Hollywood writ large. No one wanted to cross Hearst, and even the studio, RKO, tried to bury it to appease him. Appeasement, of course, never works, which America, by then embroiled in World War II, should have known. Despite its innovations, Welles would win just one Academy Award, Best Original Screenplay, which he shared with Herman J. Mankiewicz, who famously said of Welles, quote, "There but for the grace of God goes God," end quote. Critically, How Green Was My Valley received plenty of praise for its strong performances, and I'm sure that the movie, about a traditional way of life, resonated with a country at war. It would go on to win 5 awards, and was a commercial hit. It's a very Hollywood-type movie in a way. Kane, meanwhile, got mixed reviews at the time of its release because it was comparatively out there. It was also a flop, thanks again to Hearst sabotaging it. It wouldn't be until years later that it got the reputation that it has now. When the French New Wave directors discovered it, they loved it and carried it to new heights. They, in turn, had a major influence on the Hollywood New Wave, who would also rediscover Orson Welles and boost his profile stateside. Kane, of course, should have won. Its influence on cinema is undeniable. The young Welles broke the rules and created a new standard that all future films would be judged by. The movie is a timeless classic, and its technical achievements would go on to become the standard. The movie has had an enduring impact on the medium, and the Academy, in their kowtowing to Hearst and traditionalism, missed an opportunity to honor a revolutionary film. The 29th Academy Awards, held in 1957, honored the movies of 1956. The year had some excellent movies, including George Stevens' epic drama Giant, which starred Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, and James Dean, as well as Cecil B. DeMille's epic The Ten Commandments. This was a remake of one of his own movies. He originally directed The Ten Commandments in 1923 during the silent era, and was now bringing it into the sound and color era with the help of Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and Anne Baxter. Both of them, however, would lose to the globetrotting around the world in 80 days, directed by Michael Anderson. The movie, based on the novel by Jules Verne, was right for the moment. It was an epic adventure around the world, energetic, expansive, and beautiful to look at. It captured the mood of America, which had emerged victorious and the lone superpower in the post-war era. The halcyon days of the Kennedy administration were a few short years away, and the future looked bright. Giant, on the other hand, was a similarly sprawling epic that captured the other side of America. It blended emotion and complex character studies, and depicted a portrait of a country that was changing quickly, starting in the mid-1920s and going through the post-war years. It showed the changing social dynamics of the country, which would soon come to a head. Both were commercial hits, but Giant was far and away the critical favorite. Boss Lee Crowther, running for the New York Times, said that, quote, George Stevens takes 3 hours and 17 minutes to put his story across. That's a heap of time to go on about Texas, but Mr. Stevens has made a heap of a film, end quote. Now, it's considered to be one of the greatest movies ever made, but the voters in the Academy, similar to how they would later give Shakespeare in Love the win over Saving Private Ryan, decided to give the grand prize to Around the World in 80 Days. The movie had broad appeal, and its festive, adventurous spirit might have been what the country wanted to abide by at the time. Giant, meanwhile, was the heavier film discussing class, prejudice, and changes in modern America. Substantial elements, to be sure, and usually Academy favorites, but not this night. Both were ambitious films, but Giant is the one that most people remember thanks to its nuanced storytelling and emphasis on characters. Around the World in 80 Days is ambitious in scope and a fun, globe-trotting adventure, but in the same way that a visually stunning but shallow movie might be. Here, the Academy chose to honor glamour over grit, though George Stevens would win Best Director, which is a fine consolation prize. Giant is also notable for being James Dean's final film as a lead actor. He would earn his second posthumous Best Actor nomination for the movie. Though long gone, his roles will certainly never be forgotten. In the mid-1960s, Hollywood, the United States, and, frankly, the entire world, was going through a bit of turmoil. The studio system was collapsing, and in just a few short years, the director would be on the rise. The United States was embroiled in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and one of the movies that was nominated for an Academy Award, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, put the dangers of nuclear catastrophe front and center with a humorous tone. Stanley Kubrick never won Best Picture or Best Director at the Academy Awards. That, on its own, is a travesty, as much of a travesty as Peter O'Toole never winning an Academy Award for Best Actor, and 1965 would not be Kubrick's year either. My Fair Lady, directed by George Cuckoo and produced by Jack Warner, took home the Academy Award for Best Picture. To be fair, My Fair Lady is a dazzling, beautiful film. The costumes are gorgeous, the sets are elaborate, and as Robert J. Landry at Variety wrote, quote, "It has riches of story, humor, acting, and production values far beyond the average big picture. It is Hollywood at its best. Jack L. Warner's career capstone," end quote. It has excellent performances from Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison, and despite seeing the movie like a decade ago, I still remember it vividly. It's a happy, romantic, technically excellent movie that captured the audience's imagination. Dr. Strangelove is nothing like that at all. Hell, the movie's not even in color. It's darkly comic satire that smartly critiqued Cold War politics. Its wit and humor were unsettling and humorous, and held one's eyes open to the fact that anyone could cause a nuclear catastrophe. And anyone could. At this point in history, the nuclear arsenal was not very well secured. Writing for The New Yorker, Eric Schlosser wrote that upon his presidency, Kennedy and his advisors were shocked to learn that, quote, "few of the weapons had locks on them. Anyone who wanted to get a hold of them could detonate them, and there was little to prevent NATO officers from Turkey, Holland, Italy, Great Britain, and Germany from using them without the approval of the United States," end quote. But in a world that had a sword of Damocles hovering over its head, people just didn't want to hear that it could be lights out tomorrow and that you wouldn't even see it coming. They wanted the beauty of My Fair Lady as opposed to the cynicism of Dr. Strangelove. Both were critically acclaimed, though Strangelove was far outgrossed by My Fair Lady. Strangelove, of course, has had a far more enduring reputation over the years. Its fearless exploration of real-world anxieties wrapped in the guise of absurd comedy helped push what satire could do, and would even enact real change within the government, which would move to secure their nuclear arsenal. Still, it would have been nice to see it win, if only to see Kubrick get his due from his peers. The 1978 Academy Awards are, perhaps, the worst snub in Academy Award history. I don't even have a preamble for them. Star Wars, directed by George Lucas, lost to Annie Hall, directed by Woody Allen. But this time, Hollywood was on the precipice of a new era that was led by George Lucas and his friend Steven Spielberg. The new Hollywood was a few short years from collapsing on itself thanks to oversized budgets and undersized returns. But Spielberg and Lucas had shown Hollywood and Wall Street what was possible by making two of the biggest movies of all time. Jaws set the record for the highest grossing film, only to be undone by Star Wars a few years later. Star Wars also got the industry hip to just how much money sequels and merchandising could bring in. These were legitimately game-changing movies, and the entertainment world that we're living in right now was made by them. Annie Hall was as far from Star Wars as you could get. It was a terrestrial romantic comedy drama that starred Woody Allen and Diane Keaton. Now, Annie Hall is not a bad movie. The screenplay is considered to be one of the best ever written, and Allen and Keaton give excellent performances. But, like Roger Ebert wrote in the first line of his review, quote, Annie Hall contains more intellectual wit and cultural references than any other movie ever to win the Oscar for Best Picture, and in winning the award in 1977, it edged out Star Wars, an outcome unthinkable today, end quote. Star Wars, meanwhile, was an event. It was an utter reconfiguration of Hollywood and movie making as a business. Lucas, who doesn't get nearly enough respect as a director or writer, introduced the world to a sprawling, mythic universe full of adventure, groundbreaking special effects, and that old classic, a battle between good and evil. Now, the movie might not have had a revolutionary story, but it absolutely revolutionized sound, art direction, and visual effects. And it also helped change the pristine image of sci-fi films into a more gritty, lived-in kind of world. Sure, Annie Hall had the nuanced performances and, arguably, more fleshed-out characters. Critics and audiences loved it, and it was still a modest hit. But Star Wars was a juggernaut. Maybe the dialogue was a bit wooden, as frankly were the characters, and critics found it a bit simplistic. But no critic worth reading could argue that the movie wasn't charming and innovative on a scale hardly ever seen before. This is a movie that captured the zeitgeist, something that's far more difficult than simply making a great movie. Star Wars was a phenomenon. That Lucas lost both Best Picture and Best Director to Woody Allen is, I think, a black mark on the Academy. Sure, he was one of the new kids on the block. Sure, he wasn't a beloved cult figure like Woody Allen. But without Star Wars and without George Lucas, the industry would still be stuck in the past. The movie's enduring sense of wonder has only strengthened with age, capturing the imagination of untold millions and setting the blueprint for what a sci-fi movie should be. Hollywood was about to step into a new era, and Star Wars is what gave it that final push. The 52nd Academy Awards are nothing if not a study in contrasts. The ultimate winner, Kramer vs. Kramer, was about a war within the family, while the one that should have won, Apocalypse Now, was about a much bloodier affair. Kramer vs. Kramer, directed by Robert Benton, was based on a novel by Avery Corman and explored the impact of a couple's divorce on their son. To be sure, it's a great movie that deserves all the critical and commercial plaudits that it received. Its exploration of gender roles, single parenting, a nuclear family coming undone, and the psychological impact of divorce on children and parents are important issues that deserve continued consideration today. Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, was also based on a book, this time Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness. A cinematic journey that takes place during the chaos of the Vietnam War, Apocalypse Now is full of intense visuals and performances, and is an unflinching look at the brutality of war. This was an ambitious movie from start to finish. The making of Apocalypse Now is a movie unto itself. The movie drove Coppola to the brink of insanity. I mean that literally. The guy was threatening to shoot himself and even had seizures over the stress of sinking literally all of his money into this movie. He thought that he was going to die at one point and wanted to leave the movie to George Lucas to finish. Francis Ford Coppola went through literal hell to get the movie made. Hurricanes, abrupt casting changes, Marlon Brando, filming in the jungle, an ongoing insurgency in the Philippines, disease and delay upon delay. It's a wonder that he survived. When you consider what went into making the movie, and the fact that the movie itself was as excellent as it was, Apocalypse Now seems like a clear winner over Kramer vs. Kramer. To be sure, critical reception for Apocalypse Now was more mixed on its first release. Kramer vs. Kramer was loved from the get-go thanks to excellent direction from Benton and stirring performances from Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep. It's a film that spoke to large swaths of the population who saw their own struggles reflected on the big screen. Apocalypse Now, meanwhile, opened a still sore wound for some Americans. Coppola, reasonably, took issue with the media focusing more about the production issues than the movie itself. The movie would win the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and Roger Ebert had high praise for it. It's worth reading an extended quote from Ebert, which not only captures the brilliance of the movie, but how cinema can speak to you. Quote, "What's great in the film, and what will make it live for many years and speak to many audiences, is what Coppola achieves on the levels Truffaut was discussing. The moments of agony and joy in making cinema. Some of these moments occur at the same time. Remember again the helicopter assault and its unsettling juxtaposition of horror and exhilaration. Remember the weird beauty of the missed helicopters lifting above the trees in the long shot, and the insane power of Wagner's music, played loudly during the attack, and you feel what Coppola was getting at. Those moments as common in life as art, when the whole huge grand mystery of the world, so terrible, so beautiful, seems to hang in the balance." End quote. It was a daring, challenging movie, and I think it ought to have been recognized for its uninhibited ambition. This is literally the movie that dreams are made of, full of rawness and intensity, and unafraid to explore the darkness of the human psyche. It's the epitome of an uncompromising, director-driven work and a transcendent film with a lasting legacy. 2015 was a pretty good year for movies, and the Best Picture nominees at the 88th Academy Awards were all deserving in their own way. The Big Short, Bridge of Spies, Brooklyn, Mad Max Fury Road, The Martian, The Revenant, Room, and the ultimate winner, Spotlight. But one of these movies, Mad Max Fury Road, was unlike the others. This was a masterpiece 30 years in the making. An intense, beautiful, kinetic epic, Fury Road captured the imagination like no other movie that year, and is not just one of the greatest action movies ever made, but one of the best movies ever made, bar none. It roared onto screens with a backstory that deserves its own movie, in fact. Miller had suffered innumerable setbacks over the years en route to making the movie, from 9/11 to a filming location being hit with sudden storms and blossoming into flowers. The frenetic, high-octane film was a thrill ride from start to finish, and an exemplar of the merging of practical effects and CGI, death-defying stunts, and a style that was discernibly Miller's own. Spotlight, meanwhile, is one of the best journalism movies ever made. It was an intense, discomforting look into the institutional corruption that lay at the heart of the Catholic Church and their abuses. It was a sober movie with excellent acting from its ensemble cast and a thought-provoking narrative. But Fury Road was something else entirely. I mean, this is a movie that can be seen in any language or even on mute, and you lose none of the understanding. That is to say that Fury Road is pure cinema in a way that very few movies actually are. It makes sense when you consider there was never a real screenplay for the movie. It was all based off of storyboards, which are, by their nature, visual. Fury Road is what movies should aspire to be. As much as I enjoyed both movies, I honestly think that Fury Road should have won Best Picture that night. Its daring, unflinching vision and the Herculean road that Miller traveled to bring it to the big screen deserve that recognition. The man didn't even win Best Director, which is a travesty unto itself. I mean, this is a genre-defining, not to mention decade-defining, work of art. There are a lot of people that think Steven Spielberg is a terrible or overrated director. I call some of these people my friends. I also call them contrarians. Because Steven Spielberg is, without a doubt, one of the most important directors of all time. Before he finally did win for Schindler's List, I think that he should have won at least 3 times. In 1975, Jaws created the modern blockbuster. It was a relentless, thrilling suspense film that was elevated to greater heights thanks to John Williams' score. The movie was momentous, and it kickstarted a change in Hollywood that reverberates to this day. It's rightly considered to be one of the best movies ever made. But in 1976, it lost the top prize to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, directed by Milos Forman. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a fantastic film that showed what happened when someone in a mental institution was at the mercy of someone else who did not have their best interests at heart. Jack Nicholson and Louise Fletcher gave some of their best performances, and the movie would win the Big Five at the Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. But worse, it was an excellent film. Jaws was a transformative film. When you consider what Spielberg went through to make the movie, not to mention his relative youth, and impeccably adapting to a constantly shifting situation that resulted in a masterpiece, it's a wonder that he wasn't even nominated for Best Director. Jaws changed what kind of movies got made and how they were marketed and released. While the loss is more understandable than the others thanks to the overall strength of Cuckoo's Nest, I still think that Jaws should have won the top prize. Fast forward to 1982, and Raiders of the Lost Ark loses to Chariots of Fire. After Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Lucas and Spielberg teamed up to create one of the most enduring action icons of the 1980s, up there with Rambo and the Terminator. Raiders helped reinvigorate the action-adventure genre, and it served as the template for future movies like The Mummy. Chariots of Fire, meanwhile, is probably one of the better sports dramas out there. It's based on the true story of two British athletes, Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams, both of whom won gold in the 1924 Summer Olympics. The movie celebrated perseverance in the face of adversity, though the note at the end does leave you with a very bittersweet feeling. But between the two, I think that Raiders was the better film. Sure, it was the good versus evil story that Lucas and Spielberg were both fond of, whereas Chariots of Fire was much more understated, but Raiders was an excellent example of the kind of excitement that you can only capture on the big screen. The union of Lucas's storytelling, Spielberg's directing, and Harrison Ford's acting came together in a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts and deserved the top prize. Then, in 1983, E.T. the Extraterrestrial would lose to Gandhi. This, like Citizen Kane's loss to How Green Was My Valley, was a shock to the industry. Hell, it was a shock to Gandhi director Richard Attenborough, who would later apologize to Spielberg and said that he thought that E.T. should have won. Gandhi was a sprawling, epic biopic of the revered historical leader and his quest. And, like so many of these, it's not a bad movie. Quite the opposite. It's a great watch and deserved its success. But it, like most biopics, was just retreading ground that had already been trodden beforehand. E.T., meanwhile, was an event. It reduced people to tears in theaters and showed that family-friendly fun was not dead and gone at the movies. It was a whimsical, charming movie that celebrated wonder and friendship, both with people like you and unlike you. Everyone loved E.T., from children to adults. Spielberg tapped into his own childhood and emblazoned it across the big screen to great effect. Both movies were critically acclaimed, and, to be sure, in the depths of the Cold War, Gandhi's message was as resounding as ever. It's a serious, thoughtful film. But as a film, as something that pushes the medium forward, E.T. was leaps and bounds ahead in terms of groundbreaking visual effects, getting people into theaters, and showing just how moving a movie could be. Decades later, it remains a cultural touchstone. I know that many people will object to me leaving off Brokeback Mountain losing to Crash in 2006, and The Social Network losing to The King's Speech in 2011. I also left off Saving Private Ryan losing to Shakespeare in Love. But I wanted to focus on movies that helped push cinema to new heights, or are considered to be some of the greatest movies ever made. This, after all, is certainly not an exhaustive list, and there are many more movies, directors, actors, and actresses that deserve to win over those who actually won. But that's just how it goes sometimes.